All right, so we talked about commas, that ever so tricky piece of punctuation in the English language. Now let's talk about semicolons. In order to avoid a comma splice, which is where you take two independent clauses and accidentally join them together with a little comma in the middle, you can take those two independent clauses and join them together with a semicolon. So a semicolon is essentially a piece of punctuation that is a little bit stronger than a comma. So it has the ability, if so to speak, to join those two independent clauses. Also, as we talked about with commas, if you have a series of items in a list, you separate them by commas. If you have a series of items in a list that have commas inside them, you separate those items in a list with a semicolon. So you see how a semicolon is kind of like a comma on steroids. It has very similar functionality, however, it's stronger. It's able to hold more weight than the mere weak and piddly little comma all on its own. So let's have a look at some of the sentences that are joining independent clauses with semicolons. Number one, I love reading books. I especially love reading scary books. So this semicolon in there is joining those two independent clauses. So I is the subject of the first independent clause or the first sentence, and love reading is the verb, and books is the object of that verb. So all we need to make a sentence or an independent clause is a subject and a verb. So I love reading books. Great, stands on its own. And we stick a semicolon, which tells us that what's going to follow grammatically is an independent clause, but at the level of content is related to what came before. So I especially love reading scary books. So that's an independent clause that's doing the work of modification. So it's modifying what came before, it's describing what came before. You don't necessarily need to know all of the technical jargon about each of the parts of the sentences, although you may want to. You do need to be able to identify subjects and verbs so that you can then identify when something is an independent clause or a subordinate clause, and therefore use a semicolon appropriately. This next one. Movies are better than books. Some movies may be as good as some books. So again, we've got that semicolon joining those two independent clauses. And then we have the subject here, movies. So what about movies? Movies are the subject. Movies are never better than books. So are better is the verb, and then never is the negative construction. So it's telling us that movies are not better than books, and the absolute construction of that negative is never. Anyway, movies are never better than books. That's our independent clause. That's all we need to make a sentence. We could stick an exclamation point or a period or any of those other end stop punctuation if we wanted to. But instead, we're sticking that semicolon in there to let us know that the next independent clause is related to whatever came before. Some movies may be as good as some books. Okay, so again, in the first independent clause, we're saying movies are never better than books. But then we're conceding some movies may be as good as some books. So again, movies is our subject here. And then we've got maybe, describing and serving as the verb in that second independent clause. On to number 3. Going home after a long journey is comforting. The old saying, home sweet home, is true. Once again, we've got that semicolon telling us that these are two independent clauses. So if we wanted, we could pull them apart and they could be two sentences and they would stand alone on their own and they wouldn't be sentence fragments because they both have subjects and verbs in them. So let's look at them a little bit more closely. Going home after a long journey is comforting. So this going home it's a gerund, but again, it's functioning as the subject. So going home after a long journey, that's our preposition, is comforting. So we've got now a linking verb. So is comforting. Anytime you see is, it's a conjugation of the verb to be. So a verb meaning being. So going home is comforting. And comforting is, again, that object of going home. The old saying, home sweet home, is true. So again, saying is true is ultimately the saying is our subject here. The saying. Old is an adjective describing what kind of saying. And then is, once again, we've got that is verb, the form of the verb to be. So again, grammatically, all of these sentences have the component parts to stand alone as independent sentences because the author has chosen to associate them conceptually and say, you know what, I want these sentences to read as though they're similar and they're providing information that is important, that it's read together as a coherent unit. I'm going to join them with a semicolon as opposed to sticking a period in between. Now, the next section, lists with semicolons. Again, this one's much more straightforward. Life-altering things happened in New York City on May 24th, 1883, December 8th, 1980, February 26th, 1993, and September 11th, 2001. If you want to be a keener, you can also go in and Google those dates and New York City into Google and see what happened. I won't give it away, but those are actual real dates when real stuff happened in New York City. What's important for us to note here is that the date convention has month, day, comma, year. And so because each of these elements in the list have this month, day, comma, year, month, day, comma, year, month, day, comma, year, if we separated the list with commas instead of semicolons, it would be confusing. So we'd have too many commas in there and we wouldn't be able to tell what was the thing in the list being listed. Therefore, semicolons are used to separate the items in the list. Same thing for number 2. I have many cousins who have brown hair, blue eyes, and glasses, who are tall, skinny, and smart, and who love books, movies, and chocolate. So because in this case, we're talking about the cousins, and the cousins have a list, and then they have another list, and then they have another list. So because there's a list within a list, each of these independent lists, so the brown hair, blue eyes, and glasses component, so that's talking about they have these 3 things separated by commas. They are these 3 things separated by commas, and who love these 3 things separated by commas. Again, because each chunk of content in a bigger list is a list, if we just used commas again to separate the bigger elements of the smaller lists, it would be too confusing. Basically, we'd have too many commas. So we use the convention of separating these elements of the list with a semicolon, these elements of the list with a semicolon, and these elements of the list ultimately with that end stop punctuation. Another type of list where there's often commas within, so the first one, there's commas within because there's dates. The second one, there's commas within because it's a list within a list. And the third one, which we'll run into commonly, is separating items in a list where it's location. Last year, I traveled to Bangkok, Thailand, so city, country, Kuala Lumpur, Malaysia, city, country, Melbourne, Australia, city, country, and Jakarta, Indonesia, city, country. And that is actually true, not last year. 2019, I did go to all of those cities and countries. And so because the convention of listing city, comma, country, if we had Bangkok, comma, Thailand, comma, Kuala Lumpur, comma, Malaysia, comma, the distinction between the unit of city, country would be lost, and we would just have a bunch of locations separated by commas. So once again, we need semicolons to separate those items in a list.